Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 4. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 5 and 6 of the Prima Pars, which is goodness in general and God's goodness specifically. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the second and revised edition translated by the fathers of the English Dominican province. So let's get started. Question 5 on goodness in general. Is goodness and being actually the same? Do they differ only in idea? Is every being good? Is goodness divided into the virtuous, the useful, and the pleasant? These are some of our questions today as we examine the reality of goodness. The first, is goodness the same as being? Well, what is goodness? What do we mean when we call a thing good? I mean, we call everything from people to a pair of scissors to a car good. What do they share in common to share the adjective? Aquinas responds, the essence of goodness consists in this, that it is in some way desirable. This is our operative word, desirable. A pair of scissors is good if it is desirable in respect to cutting. The car is good insofar as it is desirable and getting from one place to another or being enjoyable. We will get into the divisions of goodness at the end of this question, but I believe common experience and common language would vindicate this essential definition of goodness, desirability. Then is it distinct from being, existing? Aquinas says only in thought, because the thing is desirable insofar as it exists, and insofar as existing in it are the things which would cause us to consider it to be good. Like a man is good, who has existing in him knowledge and virtue, and everything naturally desires those things perfective to it. Let's say food, drink, sleep, to become more, to become greater in being, to acquire being. So desirability, goodness, and being are synonymous in some ways, which is interesting to think about. Then evil, which is the privation of good, we'll talk about that much later, as simply being less, as becoming less, not just less good, but since being and goodness are the same, being evil is being less. So what is goodness? It is being considered under the aspect of desirability. Now, which is first according to our thought? Well, being comes first as the proper object of all our knowledge, because things are known because they first exist. And from here, additional notions could be added to being, such as desirableness or goodness. Next is everything good. Well, insofar as it exists, for sure. Things are called evil insofar as they lack some being proper to them, like a bad eye is missing health, a bad man is missing virtue or the correct intention. Evil men are good insofar as they exist and possess the perfections that they do, and they are evil insofar as they lack those things which they ought to have that are proper to them. Here we would further distinguish between moral evils and physical evils, but we'll see that later in the Summa. Aquinas then asks whether goodness has the aspect of a final cause. Final cause here meaning, does goodness have the aspect of an end or a goal for which something is, exists, or is done? Is goodness a cause of things precisely by being the goal of things? Yes, because goodness means a kind of desirability. In its definition is the notion of tending toward it, toward some goal, toward something we take to be desirable. Ask yourself, what is the cause of you listening to this podcast? Was it not some good, something you found desirable? Maybe that's knowledge or something to pass the time. That end was something desirable, a good that positively caused you to listen to this podcast. This is why it's also said that the good is diffusive of itself, like the sun is diffusive of itself. It pulls its surrounding environment towards it. That's what goodness does. Then Aquinas gives us an aside, it seems, but a very profound aside. He asks whether beauty and goodness are the same. Maybe because beauty is definitely a cause of pulling rational being towards it. He says they are the same fundamentally as both being based on a thing's existence, its essence, existence combo, those co-principles, but they differ logically, beauty and goodness, because goodness relates to our will. We desire goodness, while beauty relates to our mind and senses. For the beautiful is, according to Aquinas, those things which please when seen. Seeing here meaning the senses for sure, but most especially the mind, seen in the mind, because truth is beautiful. The beautiful is that which is duly proportioned, Aquinas will mention. In another place, Aquinas will expound on that and say, for beauty includes three conditions: integrity or perfection, since those things which are impaired are by the very fact ugly, due proportion or harmony, and lastly, brightness or clarity. Clarity here is the clarity of that innermost structure of the thing coming through it, its form, its nature, shining through it. So if our nature is the rational animal, the most beautiful human being should be the one in which we can see rationality, its nature, as much as that can be perceived visibly in a person, and then also the best of animality, clearly. But we're getting a little sidetracked here. Next article, whether the essence of goodness consists in mode, species, and order. Where are these three divisions coming from? At least from Scripture, it says in Wisdom chapter 11, thou hast ordered all things in measure and number and weight. These terms are not likely to be very interesting or relevant to a listener in 2024, but insofar as a created thing exists, it came from something, its efficient cause, and for material things, a material cause. It is a particular kind of thing. It's species. It has a kind of nature form, and it is ordered to some goal or end, which is order. So a created thing would have mode, that was the first, species, the second, and order, because those are the aspects of its being. Because of the relationship between being and goodness, Aquinas then says, hence the essence of goodness, so far as it consists in perfections, consists also in mode, species, and order. This applies to created things. Next question is whether goodness is rightly divided into the virtuous, the useful, and the pleasant. Here are our divisions of goodness. Now, this division comes to us from St. Ambrose, and so it's going to be taken as a fact from authority in the Summa by St. Thomas Aquinas, and he'll explain them. Now, remember, goodness is being as considered under the aspect of desirability, and a thing can be desirable or good in a couple different ways. A thing can be desirable not so much for its own sake, but for the sake of attaining something else. So medicine might be desirable for the sake of health. This is an example of a useful good. It's our first division. A thing may be desirable as an end, as something to simply rest in, as Aquinas puts it, but not necessarily objectively good for the one resting in it. This would be the pleasant, Aquinas says. Then thirdly, a thing can be desirable for its own sake, as something objectively good that just ought to be desired and pursued, an end in itself as well. This is the virtuous, the honest good. Think about loving God and neighbor would fall under this kind of good. Now that's a look at question 5. Let's move on to question 6 on God's goodness. First, we must ask, is God good? Now that seems like an easy answer. It's going to get more complicated as we continue, but keep in mind our definition of goodness. Aquinas said the essence of goodness consists in this, that it is in some way desirable. That desirability is based on being, so the greater the being, the more desirable is the thing in itself. In this way, God is definitely good, since whatever being we happen to find out here must pre-exist, as we mentioned in the last episode, in its cause in a more preeminent way, which is God. In this way, it's also true that insofar as a thing is pursuing some good, it is pursuing God, because all of these goods, beings, are but shadows, or what St. Thomas called similitudes, to that font from which they have come. So when loving or looking, desiring anything, we are desiring God, in which these created things, however remotely and analogously, do resemble. So if God is good, is he the supreme good? Here, St. Thomas quotes Jesus, who says in Mark 10, "No one is good but God alone." Now that should shock us. It's a good reminder for us, if it could be put in a lesson, these words of Pope Benedict XVI in his Regensburg address. He said, "The faith of the Church has always insisted that between God and us, between his eternal creator spirit and our created reason, there exists a real analogy, in which, as the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 stated, unlikeness remains infinitely greater than likeness, yet not to the point of abolishing analogy in its language." So between our notion of goodness down here and the actual goodness of God in himself, as the Lateran Council said, unlikeness remains infinitely greater than likeness. And that's really what Jesus is pointing out, that God's being and his goodness in himself, again, transcends category. As Aquinas said at the beginning of the Summa, we cannot know what God is, only what he is not. Yet there is an analogy, similarity and dissimilarity between our notion of goodness down here and God's goodness. So, can we say God is supremely good? We can't. If what we have in mind is a category of good in which God is simply the highest in that category, because again, God is outside of all category, but we can say he is the supreme good as the cause of all particular goods, actual or possible. And again, to be in the effects, this goodness must pre-exist in a more preeminent way in its cause, which is God. That bleeds into our next article. Whether to be essentially good belongs to God alone, which we can simply agree to as having already spoken about. Here Aquinas quotes Boethius, who says, "All things but God are good by participation, therefore they are not good essentially." Now participation here meaning having existence, having goodness, but not being existence, being goodness, which, as we saw, the question of God's existence and God's simplicity, that is the definition of God alone. What's good to take away from this section, though, is a kind of map to perfection. Things are perfect, Aquinas will say here, insofar as they exist. That's the first step. Insofar as certain qualities and accidental characteristics, non-essential characteristics, are added to their existence, that's the second step. And insofar as a thing attains its end and is able to rest in that end for which it is created, that's the final step. That is a broadest path for someone who wants to increase in goodness. Lastly, we're going to ask, are all things good by the divine goodness? Well, they're actually good by their own goodness. Of course, their goodness has a cause, and a cause for its ongoing existence, but our goodness, our being, is truly ours. Contrary to pantheism, we're not merely parts of God. We are created by God, but as something that exists itself, as something distinct. St. Thomas says we are good by the divine goodness as the first exemplary, effective, final principle of that goodness, exemplary, and that our goodness, again, pre-exists in a better way in God, effective, and that God is the positive cause of our goodness, and final principle in that God's goodness is the reason why any other goods happen to exist, that he created any other goods. Yet, everything is called good by its own goodness, which is a similitude or participation of the divine goodness. In a word, Aquinas concludes, and so of all things there is one goodness, and yet many goods. This is question 5 and 6 of the first part of the Summa, Goodness in General and God's Goodness specifically. Again, my name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I can't wait to see you tomorrow.